On the 1st of May, 1945, a man walked into a Berlin garden with his wife and 6 children. The city was burning. Soviet artillery was landing close enough to rattle the walls. The war was over in every way that mattered. Hitler was already dead, 1 floor below. The man's name was Joseph Goebbels, and he had spent 12 years telling 80 million Germans exactly what to think, what to feel, and what to die for. Now he arranged his children in a row. He watched a doctor sedate them with morphine. He watched his wife crush cyanide capsules into each of their mouths, one at a time, starting with the oldest, who was 12. Then he walked outside, stood against a wall, and told an SS orderly to shoot him. Here is what nobody tells you about that moment. He didn't do it because he believed. The man who built the most powerful propaganda machine in human history had written in his own diary, in his own hand, that the German people deserved exactly what was coming to them. He knew. He always knew. The man who read too much, every senior Nazi wasn't drawn in by logic or ideology. They came through raw rage and deep humiliation. Emotions that didn't need justification, just an enemy to blame. Rosenberg genuinely believed his Aryan mythology. Stryker had been ranting about Jewish conspiracies in beer halls since 1919, and Himmler truly thought he was a reincarnated medieval king. These men weren't cynical performers. They were true believers who had completely lost themselves in their own madness. Joseph Goebbels was always behind it. He was born on October 29, 1897, in Reit, a small factory town in the Rhineland, into a lower-middle-class Catholic family that took religion seriously and money carefully. His father worked in a cotton wick factory. They were not poor, but they were close enough to poverty to feel its breath. And from almost the beginning, the boy was wrong in the way that marks you for life. A childhood bone infection left Goebbels with a shortened leg, a deformed foot, and a permanent limp. A cruel irony for a man who would soon serve a regime obsessed with physical perfection and Aryan body culture. When World War I began in 1914, Goebbels tried to enlist twice and was rejected both times because of his foot. Forced to sit in university lecture halls while his entire generation was dying in the trenches. That rejection didn't just wound his pride, it planted something far darker inside him. Between 1914 and 1921, Goebbels attended 8 universities: Bonn, Freiburg, Würzburg, Munich, Cologne, Frankfurt, Berlin, Heidelberg. 8. He was chasing something no single institution could give him, some proof that his mind was compensation enough for everything his body couldn't do. He studied literature, history, philosophy, and German philology. In 1921, he submitted his doctoral thesis at Heidelberg, a study of a minor 19th century Romantic playwright, and was awarded his doctorate with distinction. He was now Dr. Joseph Goebbels. And absolutely nobody cared. Goebbels poured himself into writing, a novel, plays, newspaper applications, and was rejected everywhere, including by Germany's most prestigious paper, the Berliner Tageblatt. He recorded every rejection in his diary with a bitterness that never left him. This is the detail that changes everything about Goebbels. Every other Nazi propagandist found the movement because the movement matched something they already felt. Goebbels found the movement because every other door had already closed. He did not bring faith to National Socialism. He brought a doctorate, a rejection letter, a furious intelligence, and 12 years of accumulated humiliation looking for somewhere to land. That combination did not produce a true believer. It produced something far more dangerous. A man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The technique nobody admits he invented. On November 11th, 1926, Joseph Goebbels stepped off a train in Berlin and looked at a city that wanted him dead. Not metaphorically, literally. In 1926, Berlin was Europe's most violent city, with communists and socialist militias dominating the streets, while the Nazis had fewer than 1,000 members in a city of 4 million. The previous Gauleiter had quit in 18 months, completely broken, so Hitler sent Goebbels in to fix it. It was either a punishment or test, possibly both. What Goebbels did next is the part of this story that history keeps filing under the wrong category. Every account describes it as propaganda. What it actually was something colder, something more surgical, something that had less in common with political persuasion and far more in common with what a laboratory researcher does when he introduces a controlled stimulus to an organism and measures the response. Goebbels did not try to convince Berlin. He decided to provoke it. He deliberately scheduled Nazi marches through the reddest working-class neighborhoods in the city, on days and at times specifically chosen to guarantee confrontation. When the street fights broke out, and they always broke out, his own newspaper, Der Angriff, which he had founded in July 1927, reported them as unprovoked communist attacks on innocent German patriots. He was engineering the violence, then repackaging it as martyrdom, then selling the martyrdom back to the people he had endangered. And it worked. While publicly performing passionate Nazi devotion, Goebbels' private diary told a completely different story. He wrote about his crowds with cold, clinical detachment, analyzing which emotional triggers worked best, which enemies generated the most fear. He wasn't a true believer in his own message. He was a director studying his audience. Then came Horst Wessel. In January 1930, a minor essay man and part-time pimp named Horst Wessel was shot in his apartment in a dispute that had more to do with unpaid rent and a disagreement over a prostitute than it did with politics. He was 22 years old and largely unknown. He lingered for several weeks, and when he died on February 23, 1930, he had become, in Goebbels' hands, the regime's founding sacred martyr. Goebbels wrote the legend almost entirely from nothing. He took a street brawler whose personal life wouldn't survive 30 seconds of scrutiny and constructed around him a myth of noble self-sacrifice, so complete and so emotionally saturated that it became almost impossible to dismantle. The song Wessel had written before his death became the second national anthem of the Third Reich. School children sang it. It was played at state funerals. It outlived the regime in the memories of everyone who had grown up under it. Goebbels knew exactly what Horst Wessel actually was. He recorded it privately. He built the myth anyway. This is what separates him from every other Nazi propagandist in modern history, and from almost every propagandist in any history. Rosenberg believed his racial mythology. Stryker believed his conspiracy theories. The machine they fed was powered by genuine conviction, however deranged. Goebbels' machine was powered by something far more unsettling than conviction. It was powered by a man who understood precisely how the machine worked, had zero illusions about the people feeding into it, and kept the engine running anyway because he was better at this than he had ever been at anything else in his life. The failed novelist had finally found his form. He just happened to be writing in human beings. The propaganda minister who hated propaganda. On March 13, 1933, Adolf Hitler signed a single decree and handed Joseph Goebbels control over every word, every image, every sound, and every idea that 80 million Germans were permitted to consume. Film, radio, theater, music, newspapers, fine arts, all of it. Every cultural surface in the most culturally sophisticated nation in Europe, handed to one man on one piece of paper in one afternoon. It was the most total information monopoly any government had ever legally constructed. And the man now running it went home that evening, opened his diary, and spent several pages writing in passionate admiration about an American film he had recently watched. Not a German film, an American one. This is where the story cracks completely open. Goebbels wasn't just interested in Hollywood, he was obsessed with it, studying it the way a film student dissects a movie frame by frame, desperate to understand exactly how it worked and why it worked so well. He watched Frank Capra. He studied the MGM studio system. He screened Charlie Chaplin films privately in his own ministerial cinema, despite the fact that Chaplin had been officially classified as a cultural enemy of the Reich. He watched American comedies, American dramas, American westerns, and filled pages analyzing their pacing, their emotional architecture, their ability to make audiences feel something before they had time to think about whether they should. He told his staff directly and repeatedly that German cinema needed to match Hollywood, not compete with it, match it. He understood something that every other Nazi cultural official completely missed, that propaganda, which announces itself as propaganda, is already dead. That the most effective manipulation is the kind that doesn't feel like manipulation at all. That the Americans had figured this out and the Germans needed to learn from it, regardless of what the official racial theory said about the men running the studios. The regime that built its entire cultural identity on rejecting American Jewish influence was, at the operational level, being run by a man who had done his graduate work on American Jewish cinema and taken extremely detailed notes. And then the diaries reveal something even darker. By September 1st, 1939, the day German tanks crossed into Poland, Goebbels was already writing privately about doubts he would never permit to reach paper in any official capacity. Not dramatic doubts, not a sudden crisis of conscience, something more corrosive than that. A quiet, clinical assessment that the gap between the story he was telling and the reality he was observing was beginning to widen in ways that might eventually become unmanageable. By December 19, 1941, when Germany declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, his diary entries had taken on a quality that no other senior Nazi document from that period contains. He was writing about the war the way a doctor writes about a patient whose prognosis he already knows but hasn't yet told the family. By February 1943, after Stalingrad, the entries become almost unbearable to read, knowing what he was simultaneously broadcasting to the German public. On the radio and in the newsreels, Goebbels was maintaining the architecture of German confidence with a professional precision that his own staff found astonishing. In the diary, he was recording the truth. 2 completely separate accounts, running simultaneously in the same brain for 12 years. Every other propagandist in the history of the 20th century eventually started to believe their own material. The Soviet commissars convinced themselves of the 5-year plan's success, even as the famine spread. The Italian fascist press eventually couldn't distinguish between Mussolini's image and Mussolini's reality. Goebbels never confused the two. Not once. Not for a single diary entry across 12 years of the most intensive propaganda operation in human history. He knew what he was selling. He knew it wasn't true. He kept selling it anyway. And the question that should haunt anyone who reads those diaries carefully is not whether Goebbels was more evil than the men who believed. It is whether he was something categorically different from them entirely. A man who chose the lie not because he couldn't see past it, but because he could see past everything and decided that the lie was the only thing worth building. The failed writer had finally found a story large enough to hold him. He just needed 80 million people to read it, whether they wanted to or not. The total war speech and the crowd that sealed its own fate. On February 2nd, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus walked out of the ruins of Stalingrad and surrendered to the Red Army. 91,000 German soldiers followed him into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 of them would ever come home. The Sixth Army, the most powerful German military force on the Eastern Front, the army that was supposed to crack the Soviet Union open like a chest, had ceased to exist. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal the day before the surrender, in the explicit expectation that a man of that rank would shoot himself rather than be captured alive. Paulus did not shoot himself. And now, Joseph Goebbels had 16 days to save the psychological architecture of the entire Third Reich before it collapsed under the weight of what had just happened. What he built in those 16 days was not a speech. It was a controlled detonation. On February 18, 1943, 14,000 people packed into the Berlin Sport Palace. Party members, SA officials, selected factory workers, uniformed Luftwaffe nurses, seated in carefully arranged blocks near the front cameras. The hall was dressed with banners. The lighting was engineered for maximum dramatic contrast. A single spotlight, a sea of darkness behind it. And at the center of all of it, a small man with a metal brace on his foot and 12 years of practiced technique in his hands. Here is the detail that changes everything about what happened next. Those 14,000 people were not a crowd. They were a caste. Goebbels had hand-selected every single person in that hall. The attendees were not drawn randomly from the Berlin public. They were vetted party loyalists, chosen specifically for their willingness to perform enthusiasm on cue. They had been briefed on the emotional arc of the event before they walked through the doors. They were positioned in the hall with the same deliberateness that a film director positions actors in a frame, placed where their responses would be most audible, most visible, most useful to the cameras recording everything. The most celebrated act of spontaneous mass passion in the entire history of the Third Reich was a rehearsed production. And then Goebbels walked to the podium and asked his 10 questions. He built them like a staircase, each one a step higher than the last. each one engineered to produce a louder answer than the one before it. Do you believe in the Führer? Do you believe in final victory? Do you want total war? The crowd answered each question with a roar that shook the rafters of the Sport Palace and carried across German radio into every living room in the country. But it was the 10th question that sealed it. He asked whether they were ready, if necessary, to bear burdens greater than any previous generation of Germans had ever borne, to fight without surrender, without mercy, without end, until victory was achieved. And 14,000 carefully selected, expertly positioned, thoroughly briefed German citizens screamed yes in a single voice that lasted nearly a minute. They were screaming for their own destruction, the firebombing of German cities, the Soviet advance through East Prussia, the 2 million German military dead still waiting in the years ahead. They were cheering for all of it, in one building, on one February night, and they had no idea. Goebbels knew. His diary entry for the evening of February 18, 1943, is one of the most disturbing documents in the entire archival record of the Third Reich. Not because it records triumph, not because it records guilt, but because it records neither. What it records instead is professional assessment. He described the speech the way a surgeon describes a successful procedure. The crowd had responded exactly as designed. The broadcast had reached the target audience at maximum emotional saturation. The operation had achieved its objectives. He did not write about the German soldiers who had just died at Stalingrad. He did not write about the German soldiers who were going to die because of what he had just set in motion. He wrote about technique. Every other propagandist who ever stood at a podium and moved the crowd was moved by the crowd in return. That transaction, that feedback loop of shared emotion, is what makes mass persuasion feel, from the inside, like something other than manipulation. It is what allows the man behind the microphone to sleep afterward. Goebbels felt none of it. He noted what worked. He filed the observation. He went home. 14,000 people walked out of the Sport Palace that night believing they had just witnessed the moment Germany found its will to fight back. They had witnessed something else entirely. They had watched a man who despised them perform their own funeral and make them applaud it. The end of the audience, on April 22, 1945, while Berlin was collapsing street by street, and every senior Nazi with access to a car and a full tank of petrol was quietly calculating their escape route, Joseph Goebbels made a decision that no historian has ever fully explained. He packed up his wife and 6 children and moved them into the Führer bunker. Not himself alone, his children, Helga, 12 years old, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 6, Heidrun, 4 years old. He brought all of them down into a concrete box 30 feet beneath a burning city with no exit strategy, no contingency plan, and no intention of surviving what was coming. Think about what was happening above ground at that exact moment. Heinrich Himmler was in secret negotiations with the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, trying to arrange a separate peace with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. Hermann Göring had already fled to Bavaria and was sending telegrams attempting to assume power. Joachim von Ribbentrop was drafting personal letters to Winston Churchill. Albert Speer was driving through collapsing German cities, actively sabotaging the Nero Decree, the order Hitler had issued to destroy every bridge, every factory, every power station in Germany before the Allies could use them. Every other senior Nazi was writing his own second act. Goebbels walked his children down a concrete staircase and closed the door. And here is the question that has split historians for decades. The question that sits at the absolute center of everything this story has been building toward. Was that final act the first genuine moment of true belief in a career built entirely on manufactured belief? Or was it something colder and stranger than faith? Was it a man so completely fused with the performance he had spent 12 years constructing that he was simply unable to conceive of an existence on the other side of it? Because consider what survival would have meant for Goebbels specifically. Himmler could claim he had tried to end the war early. Speer could point to the sabotage operations. Göring could construct a defense around his Luftwaffe service record. Every other senior Nazi had at least the architecture of a post-war story, however dishonest, however transparent to anyone paying attention. Goebbels had nothing. He was the lie. 12 years of it. documented in newsreels and radio broadcasts, and carefully staged public spectacles that bore his fingerprints on every frame. There was no version of the post-war world in which Joseph Goebbels could exist as anything other than the most legible criminal in the entire Reich. Every other senior Nazi could point somewhere else. Goebbels had spent 12 years making sure every camera pointed directly at him. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, with Hitler already dead for 24 hours and Soviet soldiers fighting in the streets 300 yards above his head, Goebbels and his wife Magda administered morphine to all 6 children as they slept. Then Magda crushed cyanide capsules into each of their mouths, one at a time, moving from bed to bed in the small bunker room where they had been sleeping, working her way from the oldest to the youngest. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig. Heidrun, every name beginning with H, in tribute to Hitler. Goebbels then walked up the concrete stairs into the Reich Chancellery Garden, the same garden where Hitler's body had been burned the previous afternoon. He told an SS orderly to shoot him. His wife took the capsule. Their bodies were doused in petrol and set alight, but the fire was incomplete, and the Soviets found them the following morning, partially burned, still recognizable. The man who had spent 12 years controlling every image that came out of Germany could not control the last one. Now place that ending next to every other propagandist the 20th century produced. Leni Riefenstahl lived until 2003, spending 60 years insisting she had simply been an artist. Hans Fritzi, the senior Nazi radio broadcaster, was acquitted at Nuremberg and died peacefully in 1953. Soviet propaganda chiefs retired to duchess. Fascist press ministers wrote memoirs. Every architect of every mass manipulation operation in modern history found a way to step out from behind the machinery when the machinery stopped running and resume the ordinary business of being alive. Goebbels could not do it, would not do it. The distinction matters, and nobody has ever quite resolved which one it was. What is certain is this. The man who understood mass psychology better than anyone in the 20th century, who borrowed from Hollywood and despised his own audiences, and privately recorded the truth while publicly broadcasting the lie, made his final editorial decision with the same cold precision he had brought to every decision before it. He chose the ending that served the story, not his survival, the story. The failed novelist who had been rejected by every publisher in Germany finally got to write a finale that no one could edit, no one could cut, and no one who witnessed it would ever willingly satisfy. The failed novelist who had been rejected by every publisher in Germany, or no one who witnessed it, Trump. He just made sure there was no one left in his family to remember it differently. That is what makes Joseph Goebbels the opposite of every other Nazi propagandist in history. Not the diaries, not the Hollywood obsession, not the Sport Palace speech. Not even the doubt he carried privately for 12 years while manufacturing certainty for 80 million people. It is the fact that in the end, the only audience he had left was himself, and he didn't believe a single word of it.